Coming up on the Fulcrum Global Podcast, we discuss the U.S. relationship in the Middle East and its impact on the cascading effects of the Russia and Ukraine war. How does this impact the future of security and stability in the Middle East, as well as the international system, and what trends should we be looking at going forward? Find out now. Stand by for Fulcrum Global. All right. Well, welcome to another episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast, where friends and peers get together to discuss and brainstorm on issues and trends impacting the world of national security, defense, intelligence, and foreign affairs. I'm Sam Kessler, the host and chief editor of Fulcrum Global, and you can check out our website at fulcrumglobal.us. Today, we have a very interesting discussion. My co-host, Nabil Rahman, who is also the PDP officer for the Society for Defense and Strategic Studies, which Fulcrum Global is a part of, will be here today. And our guest today will be Adam Roosevelt. And Adam is a decorated combat veteran. He's an entrepreneur, a cyber expert, ex-Politico, national news on-air analyst. Mr. Roosevelt is the CEO of AR International Consulting, LLC, which is a global advisory firm specializing in the global use of dual-use technology, cybersecurity, intelligence, and compliance. He is a frequent guest on the international media outlets around the world with over 200 plus appearances, appearing on Fox News, Sky News, Arabia, NBC, Newsmax. Mr. Roosevelt also served as a senior executive advising Silicon Valley, U.S. Department of Defense, and the U.S. Department of Homeland Security on advanced technology integration in support of U.S. national security. In addition, he has a career background in the public and private sector, advising 17 critical infrastructure sectors. Adam, it's a real pleasure to have you on. I'm glad we finally were able to get you on here.
My pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen, for inviting me. Well,
you have a very interesting background, and we're going to really dive into some of the key issues that are going on currently. The first area we're going to cover is an area that you cover a lot, which is going to be the Middle East. And we're going to look at in terms of, what has happened in terms of the Biden administration's relationship with Middle Eastern countries as a result of the cascading effects of the Russia and Ukraine war. Can you dive into some areas that you're covering in that area?
Sure. So first, again, let me start by saying thank you for having me. One additional role that I hold, I am the board member and the U.S. appointed representative for the private office of His Highness Sheikh Sakr bin Mohammed Al Qasimi. That family, the Qasimi family, rules two of the emirates in the United Arab Emirates. One of the emirates is called Sharjah, and the second emirate is called Ras Al Khaimah. The perspectives that I originally had was mostly from the U.S. side. As a U.S. military veteran, having served in the Middle East into two campaigns in Afghanistan, there are different campaigns that we focus on for a variety of different reasons: military, intelligence, and really developing relationships and helping to build out these underdeveloped nations. So I served two tours in Afghanistan, so I have that perspective. But now working for the royal family, I get a chance to see how Washington works, but also how the Middle East works, and just the global power that the UAE is, and then their other relationships with other coalitions. Now, I've studied this issue as a member of the military and as well as a member of the national security agencies, not just the Homeland Security, but how we collaborate with FBI, CIA, ODNI. Let me say some of the terms: Officer Director of National Intelligence, the National Counterterrorism Center, Customs and Border Patrol from a national vetting perspective, national targeting, how we target terrorists and so forth. So I come to the table with this perspective. Now, under the Trump administration, I think we saw a very strong relationship between the United States and the Middle East. We saw, for example, Jared Kushner ushered in one of the biggest accomplishments today that we can say in this generation, which was the Abraham Accords. So we know that the trade relations between Israel and the UAE have been bolstered and enhanced. So we had a very strong milestone as a country to broker that relationship. It is extremely difficult in foreign affairs to build this type of relationship that commits trade, it commits military collaboration. You've got a lot of intel work together with these two countries. So a major accomplishment. So President Trump was known as a friend of the Middle East. On the ground here in the UAE, everybody loves Trump. It's very interesting to observe this from folks who are Arabs to folks who are in Israel. It's amazing to see how much respect they had for America at the time, as well as just the personal feelings toward, our former president. Now, again, we're going to try to maintain neutrality in these statements about some of the changes that have degraded the U.S. in terms of us being seen as the peace and security partner. I will say the first thing that put us on the trajectory of the negative PR in terms of how America is seen is how we handled Afghanistan. Now, having been in Afghanistan, we know there's two major factions, Al-Qaeda and also ISIS. Those organizations are terrorist organizations, but on the ground, they are seen as government bodies. And now with the withdrawal of Afghanistan, we made some, I think, early decisions in terms of how we withdrew. And I think that was the first major event that began to put America in a position of negative public relations. Now, as we fast forward from that conflict, I think a lot of the adversaries in other first world countries wanted to move and effectively position themselves as a peace and security partner. Fast forwarding, we ran into the Russia-Ukraine war. I remember when I was with Fox News talking to, whoa, is this still working? I think we're still, can you hear me?
Yeah, everything's working.
Yes.
Okay, fantastic. Got you. So what's interesting was the Russia-Ukraine war. Before Russia invaded, this would have been the second time. So let's be clear about that. In 2014, Crimea was annexed. So we know that the Russians have history in terms of invading. So it wasn't new. If you look at U.S. Congress and legislative priorities, the United States did actually start a fund that was focused on, making sure that Russia would not continue to be an aggressor globally and in specific locations. So there were funds committed already prior to Russia invading the Ukraine. And this is something that you would effectively position yourself to prepare by putting resources in place, making sure your military doctrine is aligned with combating Russia aggression. So we had already done that as a country, okay? Now, when Russia began to build up troops on the border, a lot of folks did not believe that Russia was going to invade, but historically they had made that decision with Crimea in 2014. And then we started seeing what I would say a phase-by-phase campaign, and I'm going to get to my point in the Middle East, a phase-by-phase campaign where first we saw a buildup of troops on the border in strategic locations. Then we saw probing activities that were essentially probing to see if Russia could conduct cyber activity. Then we saw human operations, which is the human intelligence aspect of trying to destabilize Ukraine from inside and investing in Ukraine politicians to what we would consider Russia's objective was to manipulate, create some forms of espionage campaigns against Ukraine. So they launched multiple military campaigns across this dimension, from naval perspective, from cyber, from intel, from espionage. And then they moved into phase two, which was the all-out invasion. Now, most people were looking to see what solutions we could put in place in order to defeat the Russian threat, okay? And what happened? We issued a series of sanctions. This is within the US's particular ability right now. But at the time, we could not put troops in this location in Ukraine because Ukraine was not a member of NATO, as you all know, and Ukraine was not a member of the European Union. This would never happen. Now, as this war continued, we were looking to see what partners were going to do around the world. The United States told China to stay out. We also told other partners, do not increase trade. We told other partners financially, we need you to work with us so that we can effectively reduce Russia's ability economically to impact Ukraine any further. If they didn't have the money, then we thought this would be a drawdown solution because their economy was going to be completely disrupted. Now, in the Middle East, one of the biggest trading partners of Russia, the UAE specifically has taken a very neutral diplomatic position. So with all of these things happening, the US is trying to influence other individual nations at this time to come on board and support the US Western alliance. What's happening, though, is that is not particularly moving in the direction that the United States wants. UAE will continue to have strong ties and relations with Russia. If you come to the UAE, you will see that Russians are very much a part of the society here. Okay, that's number one. So with now we talk about other, really quickly, coalitions. We have coalitions that often are not discussed. OPEC, OPEC Plus, we know that is a very strong group of folks who run the oil and gas industry, which now we're seeing so many issues with inflation, the rising consumer prices, and some form of this is tied to the gas and oil and gas sector because of the Russia-Ukraine war. Now, UAE continues to trade with Russia. Now, I'll end it here and say that we have seen so many degraded relations between the U.S. and the Middle East because of a few things. Biden, the president, did not come to the UAE for a year and a half. Actually, when Trump was in office, he came. It was his first trip. So the Middle East did not see a strong commitment under the Biden administration because it took 1 year and a half for the president to come and bolster trade relations. And then I'll say here with the Houthi rebels in Yemen, the United States pulled out their support in Saudi Arabia. So UAE, Saudi Arabia are very close with military diplomatic ties. And naturally, when Saudi makes a decision, the UAE will remain neutral but follow Saudi Arabia because they're such a strong trading partner. So we had the Yemen Houthi crisis. We were judged for not supporting Saudi. The Yemen Houthis carried out attacks on critical infrastructure in Abu Dhabi and also in Saudi Arabia. So it essentially was looked at as the United States not protecting its partner. And again, these things aggregated have changed the relations between the United States. There's much more to talk about, but this is just kind of an idea of what's happened from Houthi rebels to not having stronger commitments under the Biden administration. And now we're seeing these things unfold. And right at this moment, Russia has a much stronger relationship in the Middle East. So let me stop there and let's unpackage a few more things. But I'll kick it back to you, Sam, Nabil, about this next topic, or if you want to pull on a specific point.
Yeah, actually, there's actually a few points I can think of in terms of the U.S. Relations with UAE and with Yemen and all of that. It sort of ties in with the ongoing pivot to Asia, but at the same time, the U.S. still has to have a presence in the Middle East, and it seems like it's a very tricky situation in terms of how are they going to still have a presence, but yet they have to put a lot of focus in what's been escalating. It's not just recent what's going on in that part of the world, but it's been evolving, and with China, Taiwan, but other issues, and also with Russia. It just seems like it's a continued. We still have to have a presence in the Middle East, but at the same time, we have to utilize what resources we have with Asia. And I mean, does America's allies in the Middle East, do they have a good understanding on that? And how does that tie in with the roles that the possible roles they may have to play at some point down the road because of that? Is that something the Biden administration is trying to make a point about, or is it not the case? I mean, I keep wondering about that.
Well, we're always going to maintain our relationships from a trade, diplomatic, and military perspective. But, I will tell you, these relationships have been around for a very long time. It's not even about the fact that we maintain good relations. The question is, can we maintain and enhance our relationships, not just from a country to country perspective, but have the human relationships, the friendships that we really need beyond just being in the government position for the 4 years that a president is in office or the 2 years that a member of Congress is in office. The Middle East is very different. It is a very traditional way of developing relations in terms of trust. They prefer you to come sit down, speak. Trust is extremely important. Once you break the trust, it's extremely difficult for you to build relations. The reason why during wartime, when you have friends, for example, NATO, we have a war, NATO will support the United States. We're all in the same coalition. So on the good, bad, and ugly days, we can assess whether or not our relationships are as strong as they need to be, because those commitments are military. We have cause of life or death in these particular conversations. With Yemen specifically, this is just one assessment criteria about the Biden administration and their lack of support with Saudi Arabia, and also particularly one of the Emirates, the Abu Dhabi Emirate, where it was attacked by the Houthi rebels. They carried out a drone strike on critical infrastructure, Abu Dhabi National Oil, and then you have, the Saudi side of it as well in terms of their oil infrastructure. So when we don't have that level of support in terms of committing our military to support them, it's very difficult to come back and try to rebuild that relationship, especially because you were not there for me during, let's say, a crisis like this. And lastly, President Biden came to Saudi Arabia and he raised the issue of the journalist who was killed, and the Saudi embassy. And it was believed that His Highness Mohammed bin Salman had been fully behind this. He orchestrated this attack. So what happened was the United States, in terms of Biden, they took a position that was very extreme against Saudi Arabia. Humanitarian rights became one of the largest topics. And now when he went to Saudi, he made a very big public relations event out of this. And I think that is extremely, extremely difficult to manage, primarily because His Highness Mohammed bin Salman, his reputation is important. What people don't understand is that this impacted money for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now investors are slow to invest. Investors don't trust that they are safe. They don't trust that their investments are safe. And what happens behind the scenes is the U.S., with the power we have, we hold back our investment power until we're able to get a stronger position. Now, that was just Saudi Arabia, but again, the relations between Saudi as an OPEC head, OPEC plus, as well as the coalitions like BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. What people do not see is the power of those relationships in the East. NATO is one organization. BRICS and OPEC plus is a much coalition. I'll give you the statistics. 40% of the world's population falls under BRICS. China is the de facto head, and they are very strong relations with OPEC members. 25% of the world's GDP falls under BRICS. So when you start looking at the statistics of power, you have to understand not just the economic power, but the long-standing trade relations between these coalitions in the East. The Eastern Coalition is much bigger today, and I think that our relations, we won't have much of an opportunity, specifically when we talk China in the Middle East, who are very strong trade partners. So that's kind of where I see the degradation of these relationships being judged at a time of war. And this is why our position under the Biden administration effectively is being questioned from a peace and security partner, a military collaborative partner, and even a trade partner.
I'm glad you brought up the BRICS because, throughout I would say the first 5, 6, 7 years of this decade, there was more talk about the BRICS. And then for the last few years, I would say maybe circa 2017, 2018, I stopped seeing much discussion about it. And it wasn't until the Russia-Ukraine war that I started hearing more buzz about the BRICS, which is really fascinating. I think it's very important because I think the discussions from the previous years when it was more of a buzzword are coming back. And what I mean by that is I recall it was around 2016, 2017, but Shashi Tharoor, who is an Indian politician and he's a former Undersecretary General of the UN, he was mentioning with the BRICS because it dealt with the rise of China and their leadership in the BRICS. And the big issue is it's really about who's telling the better story about everything. I mean, the US has a good story about, democracy, freedom, economics, all that stuff. But in terms of soft power projection, the Chinese have really been building that up a lot throughout the BRICS. And it's just really interesting. It's good you brought that up because I think people are going to hear more about the BRICS going forward that they probably didn't hear about 5 years ago as much. Like you said, it has a lot of impact. So bringing up the humanitarian aspects during his Saudi Arabian visit. I mean, if you were the person advising on what to discuss, would you suggest like that would be the talking points he should discuss while meeting with him? I mean, is it something like a negotiation tactic, that he's using, or is he just catering to his people back home? In other words, I mean, yeah. Like you said, there's some serious issues with energy and other aspects in the Middle East. So what are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely. Well, let's put it into an analogy. You got 100 people in a building being held by gunpoint. When you go in, you send the best negotiator. We understand that the public wants to hear certain things, but the reality is we've got 100 people effectively that need to be protected and taken out of the building so they can be brought to safety. The analogy here is making sure you've got the right negotiator. It was not in the advisory cards for President Biden to bring that issue up at a time now where the world needs the United States to solve one conflict, which is the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Now we have to talk about the conflict in terms of the impacts of the Russia-Ukraine war. So where people have been rioting, Sri Lanka collapsed. Around the world, we're seeing people go hungry. I'm reading stories in periodicals on women and their children who are standing in lines just to get gas. People who have been robbed because their car had gas and someone broke in to take the resource. This is not being discussed to the full extent, but a lot of places around the world are taking significant hits. And right now, the United States has to focus on the main objective, which is to make sure we reduce our involvement in more tension. We've got Russia, Ukraine. Now we got the Taiwan situation, Nancy Pelosi. We've got the unfortunate degradation of our relationships in the Middle East. We've got all these different things happening. So the main objective was to broker a deal that would have allowed two parties to come together and say, what can we do to increase output for OPEC to meet the certain demands of the global market? But also taken to the reality is that OPEC, very strong relations with Russia. So prior to the war, we know that Russia, OPEC, Saudi Arabia, UAE already had pre-existing strong relationships. The United States took the position of almost demanding the East to stay out of the way, all while funding and distributing weapon supplies to the Ukraine, but telling the other players that they could not get involved if they were not NATO. It's very difficult to tell someone else who's been working with their partners for generations that they can't get involved, but we can send weapons and, fund the Ukraine with taxpayer dollars. So, this is where you meet the East and the West in terms of independent authority, in terms of doing what, the Middle East thinks is going to serve the interest, not just of the Emirates, but their partners as well. So I think we need better negotiation personnel. And I don't think that President Biden is able to bring this across the line. So I think that this is going to be something that continues to go downhill, and everyone on this side of the aisle, on this and the eastern side, does not believe that Biden is, not everyone, but a large number of folks that I have had the time to sit down and speak with, do not believe that he is the leader that can bring these relations to a stronger position based on a variety of different historical decisions that he's made within a year and a half.
Well, and results equal perception, and when that happens, it creates some very strong opinions. And I mean, I would say here in the U.S., it's very easy to get caught up in it, but you forget how other countries are perceiving that stuff. And I mean, let's say if you were consulting with State Department, do you think it's like a change in strategy, or is there something in the field of foreign affairs that needs to be updated in terms of how to go about this new strategic reality we're entering? What do you think are some things that are needed? Because the last 20 years is a whole lot different than what we're about to enter, or we're entering now. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, there are a few different terms that I will coin. Economic diplomacy is one tool. I think that that's important. Trade relations are extremely important, but also looking at, for example, in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very large nation, but at the same time, it has strategic priorities that it would like to see move forward. There's a project called NEOM, for example, and His Highness Mohammed bin Salman is literally putting together the future of Saudi Arabia to now make it a destination for business, trade, military collaboration. There's a lot happening in Saudi Arabia beyond just this one particular issue. And I think the State Department, working with not just the presidential administration, but also the governors in each state. We got 50 states independently working together as the United States, but trade relations, establishing virtual trade bridge, small businesses, veterans, we should be advocating for those type of trade relations, because we're still getting something out of it, and we're taking part in the future of a developing nation in terms of what their infrastructure will look like. But that trade feeds into NEOM, and this is one of His Highness Mohammed bin Salman's objectives. So let's talk the objectives and priorities of the countries that we're trying to actually influence. And lastly, I would say, I think that Biden made a mistake with the Abraham Accords version 2, which he went to Israel. Okay, when he went to Israel after the trip, he goes to Saudi Arabia and he pushes the Abraham Accords. I don't think that he was in the position to push the Abraham Accords and enhanced relations between Israel and Saudi Arabia. We had other things that we needed to get taken care of. We needed to talk about the oil and gas piece, the rising cost of inflation. This is the only topic on the agenda that I think should have been focused on. I understand that we are a major government, global power, but we needed to get that solved. So he had multiple secondary priorities. And from the aspect of Saudi Arabia, Israel and Saudi relations is not the thing that they essentially see as the number one priority. So I think that we have to come realistic with our agendas. But if we have tension between two families, we have to solve those tensions before we bring 10 different requests to the table, as if, those other priorities have not been solved. And again, I'll say rising cost. And then we also had the Yemen issue and the Houthi rebels, which we're currently operating under our armistice right now. But there's a lot of spilled blood. There's a lot of historical tensions between this particular conflict. And, those two things were very high priority because it protects critical infrastructure, economic security of Saudi Arabia. So those two things should have been priority one. But again, the negotiator that we sent is trying to get everything out of the deal where he effectively returned back, and OPEC did not agree to increase production. In fact, it was just the opposite. So, yeah, I think we're going to continue to have strained relations if we don't get innovative in our strategy of negotiation. We have to stop following the textbook. We have to start looking outside the box. And I think developing these developing infrastructure objectives in Saudi Arabia, in the UAE, here we're talking space fashion. Here we're talking artificial intelligence integrated into smart cities. We're talking smart cities. I think we want to put our economic focus on developing these nations, from a public perspective as well as a private sector perspective. This is what economic diplomacy looks like, and is a valuable tool to negotiate during a time of we'll say, ruptured relationship.
How does the situation with Iran, how does that impact what's going on with the U.S. relationship with UAE and Saudi Arabia? There has to be some kind of tie to that affecting things. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, the whole situation about Tehran and the government there, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, a lot of folks do not want to see Iran become a nuclear state with capabilities to carry out strategic attacks against their adversaries. We know that has been accepted as a large position across many nations. We know that under President Trump, we pulled out of the JCPOA primarily because the Tehran government was not in compliance. They were covertly still moving forward with enriching their uranium program. So President Trump decided that instead of continuing to pay you, let's say in a form of cash, we're going to pull out of that agreement because we're actually contributing to your economy, which you're then diverting funds effectively to develop your nuclear program. Not just that as an example, but also during the September 9/11, also some of the wars in the Middle East, we have had strategic intelligence that has shown us as truth that Iran was involved in state-sponsored terrorism. Some banks, for example, what's called the Iraq War Fund, were effectively targeted in terms of litigation and paid the consequences, but Tehran used these banks effectively to move money to finance state-sponsored terrorism. So we have many real stories that tie Iran to creating campaigns to harm America, to harm America's adversaries. So this isn't just a slow down Iran in terms of enriching their uranium programs, but also containing Iran in terms of its extremist views and making sure that Tehran cannot join the global stage of nuclear capability to either carry out direct attacks or threaten their adversaries, being the United States and NATO, with nuclear consequences. So I think if Tehran is able to develop a nuclear capability, which they're very close to doing, the negotiation will be much different. And with the assassination of General Soleimani, as we know, which was carried out, we know that they are looking for forms of retribution, and they will work to do that. We know that they've made threats against President Trump. They made threats against the former Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, former CIA director. So they've made it clear that they want retribution for killing one of their most senior generals, and they will stop at nothing to get that retribution in any way possible, whether it be physically threatening or carrying out attacks against Americans, or working through proxies to effectively target American interest anywhere around the world, should they be in the position to do that. So economically, they're using their economics as well as strategic intelligence to really campaign. And we don't know when the day will come, but they are focused on carrying out some form of attack to get retribution for the assassination of General Soleimani.
The relationship with China and Russia, how would you tie that, since you're talking about reciprocating the attack with Soleimani and their continued advances to achieving nuclear capabilities? How would the relationship with China, because they have longstanding relationships with both, and I know with China they recently, within the last couple of years, established a long-term relationship, a partnership. If it's an actual relationship, I'm not fully certain. I think they have some things going on, but I'm not sure how extensive it is. But how does that play into the other issues with Russia and China? Would they be like a kind of like a partnership and part of it, or, I mean, these are all adversaries with their own spheres of influence and their areas of power and agendas and everything. How strengthened do you think they are if they work together, in other words?
Well, I would say that first, if we talk from China's perspective, the Belt and Road Initiative is their number one priority. You know, the personality of China as a government, as a communist regime, forget the communist term, but more so focused on how China believes it will accomplish world dominance by 2030, which is measured against the GDP of their country to one, outpace the United States, but use its strategic money and investments as intelligence tools for espionage. We have the Committee on Foreign Intelligence, what is it, CFIUS. If you're familiar with CFIUS, the Committee on Foreign Investments in the United States, all these things play together. But what happened is the United States, in recent decisions like Nancy Pelosi, gives the Eastern Alliance a reason to work together long enough to make sure the United States loses its position as the trusted partner for peace and security, as the trusted partner for collaboration. So I think right now China has a reason to approach Afghanistan. China has a reason to collaborate with Tehran. China has a reason to collaborate with Russia, and that reason has just been cemented primarily because the Taiwan conversation. China was just looking for one reason in order to make an extreme decision. If you look at what the U.S. told China, stay out of the Russia-Ukraine war, don't fund Russia. But Nancy Pelosi flew out to Taiwan. China believes Taiwan is its own sovereign territory in terms of being under the Chinese geography, the map. They own it. They believe it. So now we've sent what you would consider to be a soft invasion, not in terms of deploying military, but sending a high-ranking U.S. Speaker to really show a message to China that this is not your territory. We will continue to do what we did with Ukraine. We will fund, support, provide military assistance, and that has direct national security threats to China. But it's more about the bigger picture here. The West is encroaching in multiple territories from China's perspective. Now, we as BRICS, in terms of China being the leader, in terms of OPEC, we as OPEC, we will now collaborate more strongly because individually the United States is encroaching on the national security interest of these nations. Russia believed that the United States was in Ukraine developing biological weapons, the submarine provocation in the Kuril Islands. So having studied all of these things, they all tie to national security implications for each individual country. And right now, we're going to see a realigned alliance in the East, and it will include new players. NATO will get two new players, Finland, Sweden, but no one is talking about who's going to get South America in terms of Colombia. We've not, as a government during this administration, focused on South America. We'll see some stronger relations between South America and the East. Afghanistan needs to fall under a coalition as well. So we'll see Afghanistan moving closer to China as well. So we have a series of things happening in geopolitics that are changing the coalition landscape. And the East right now is expanding more rapidly. And because China was smart about investing all over the world, even in Africa and developing nations, even locations that you probably have never heard of, like Vanuatu and the archipelago islands that are surrounding these locations, China has strategically invested, and they control not just supply chains in China, but also through strategic investments, they control, we'll say, equity. For example, we call it debt trap diplomacy, which was a term that was introduced under the Trump administration. For example, Sri Lanka, they took a lot of money from China. Now they've defaulted. What does that mean? That means that China sees this location as an asset that, just like a standard loan, once you default, there are terms and conditions. So they're acquiring strategic critical infrastructure around the world. And if we're not careful, they will accomplish their objective. Even on a downturn with rising inflation, they're still on track to be successful.
Yeah, it's interesting with Sri Lanka. I remember a couple of years ago, they had the issue with building up ports. And with Sri Lanka, India has a lot of influence there too. But one thing that China does have is more spending capital or in terms of influence in the country. What's interesting with the whole island chain in that part of the world, with the Solomon Islands in particular, which is fascinating, because they were talking about putting a military base, and there's a lot of buzz about that, and a lot of people were trying to counter that. And I think, if I recall, there was an agreement that they would not have a base there, but and they would renew their relationship with Australia. But there was something along the lines, I'm trying to remember, because there's still support with Beijing, and what I keep hearing is that there's a lot of sentiments in that part of the world where, they really don't want to have a big conflict or a big clash. And so they're okay. Some people there are okay working, doing business with Beijing. And it seems kind of like a information operation in terms of, we may have to do a military base here, but then they back out in terms of, we'll do business instead. That seems like a tactic that we constantly see, and it ties to the whole debt trap you are bringing up with that was brought up. So it's
absolutely, it's a fascinating conversation. And now with Russia as the aggressor, China can always be the liaison. It's amazing to see how strategically, if you look at President Trump's administration, where we had the trade war, and there was a lot of aggression, in terms of leveraging tools to really go head to head with China. And then, the terms used against China in terms of the pandemic. And there was a large group of population of people who believed China had effectively been behind this pandemic. But now fast forwarding today, for example, China has repositioned itself at the global stage of being the liaison between nations. So I think that because strategically they operate like an intelligence organization with a venture capital private equity background, they're always the friend. The friend gives you money. The friend donates. The friend invests. The friend isn't talking military. They're talking strategic, economic, diplomacy, but it's not their first day doing this. They've been doing it for a long period of time. And the debt trap diplomacy is one of the tools. This is a academic institutional body, if you will, and down to the youngest kid, they have trained, let's say, from an academic perspective, to think a certain way, to leverage money a certain way. But at the macro level, they have been extremely successful with strategic investments for intelligence and dominance objectives.
Yeah, it brings up with the whole issues of unrestricted warfare doctrine, 3 warfare strategies, which it's public relations, economics, law, sociology. I think a few are they're tied together in categories, but you understand what that's
absolutely multi-dimensional strategic approach to accomplishing a macro level objective.
Yeah, well, it's something that people have been discussing it or writing it in papers. But when it comes in policy, we're still trying to get caught up in dealing with that type of soft power projection. And I mean, is it, has the U.S. been too accustomed to a certain level of power that hasn't had much opposition? And it just seems like it's relearning that, or hopefully relearning it, but it takes a lot of pain and suffering before you actually have to get back in shape and start dealing with a lot of those issues. But this international system that is really changing, it can be very high stakes, and it can really have a great impact. And if you don't get it right the first time, or if you don't, you could really lose out a lot. I mean, there's history is ripe with examples where people were not really, maybe they had the potential to really get to a certain level of strength or formidability, but the other one that really, they put all the infrastructure, they set it up, they had all the things needed, and Next thing you know, you have a pandemic that shuts down the world and it disrupts the supply chain. People who do red team analysis or targeting analysis, they would say, well, these were a lot of vulnerabilities that if they weren't patched up, there's some potential issues that you can deal with in scenarios. But how do you going forward? Like, do you just swallow your pride and then you re-strategize, reformat? Leadership has to change a certain kind of mindset to deal with these new threats. And I mean, the thing with Belt and Road Initiative is it's been around for a good while. I think, internally, China has some serious issues that, we can't ignore because it could be whether it's a debt bubble or other social issues in terms of the lockdowns and everything. That could disrupt their plan too. But then again, it could just mean that it just quickens the divide or the formulation of a block system. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I have had the opportunity to serve in the uniform and then had the opportunity to work for another quasi-government agency, here, maybe the first American to have this role in the Emirates. And what I envision is changing the way we govern. Now, what I am advocating for, and most people would think it is craziest thing you could ever think of, but I'd like to see dual citizen special envoy appointment. And what I mean by that is you have an envoy who has a dual citizenship, for example, American citizen who has dual citizenship with Saudi. I'd like to see a new corps of diplomats created as a marriage, a diplomatic marriage between two countries. Now, we're looking at these particular innovative diplomatic frameworks. And I think the appointment of new special envoys who maintain two citizenships, again, most people would, it's always the new minds that bring things to the table. Space Force, for example, before the State Department was formed, there was something else. And as we continue to enhance our relationships in the time of war, you have to be able to not just represent one perspective. How many people are trained, truly trained on the ground from Saudi Arabia, from UAE, from Russia, who understand this framework? I'll give you an example. The UAE is the only country that has created a framework where all nations, no conflicts in one zone, no conflicts. So what is the future now of diplomats who don't have the full understanding of frameworks from the East? So I like to see the Western and Eastern frameworks and a hybrid governance strategy before we lose the coalition. Because at this point, what the road that we're currently on is a deeper divide between these coalitions. And at some point in time, we will never be able to return back. But I think extreme, innovative diplomatic frameworks like the ones I'm advocating for, dual citizenship envoy, something to think about. We may be laughing right now, but in the future, we may see a dual-hatted envoy in the time of war, especially when the world is faced with inflation, riots, low resources, food insecurity challenges. I think we need to have a different perspective on the diplomatic corps of how we get things done between the West and the East. And this is the only thing I would say extreme today that we should explore.
Yeah, especially like you mentioned with a period of low resources. I think we're also in a period of where we're in a growing arms race with limited resources at the same time. And it's confusing. And I keep trying to look at what previous periods were, like the 1930s were leading up to the Second World War. But I don't know. I guess, situation with the BRICS, I think it's going to continue to evolve, and it's in terms of Chinese diplomacy in those areas. It really depends on how much influence they have. Like the area of Afghanistan and Pakistan is a very interesting area because of the corridor around there and how it could potentially be a window or a way to lead to the Middle East for Beijing as well as in Europe. But Nabil, do you have any questions?
Sorry, my internet connection has been a little unstable. One of the things I am curious about is with China leading the way as rising power, we have already been discussing how it has been progressing forward in its Belt and Roads initiative. A lot of talk has been on how it is with BRICS, if anything. Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South America, I believe. And there has been a lot of talk as to what that means for the West, if anything. But and there has been some comparisons made and talking as to the alliance this has been making in the East versus NATO. But from what I've seen so far, it seems to be more of the grouping is more of focusing on the economics of these nations and more focused on pretty much challenging Western governance and how they've set up the international system, like the G7 and the G20 has dominated for over years. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think we're already seeing a shift now, in terms of looking at alternative payment systems. I mean, obviously the central bank and how that system works for a variety of objectives, whether it be, counter-terrorist financing, having one system for transactions so that, we can get money, we can have business relations and so forth. There's a lot to unpackage there, but surely Russia had already created an alternative payment system within Russia. So, we're familiar with the term like SWIFT, and there's another system that Russia developed. Now they were reaching out to China in order to develop a solution that would move away from the Western dominance model. And they've actually managed to be successful in terms of small progress to start moving away from this dependency and really shaking up the framework. And I don't think many people really understood President Putin's education. And I think his education, he's a very clever person. And I think sometimes we misread the KGB's academic prowess, if you will. And I think that we should have taken a much more closer look at Putin's strategies, because now he is changing how we see the system financially. The whole objective of sanctions was supposed to be to collapse the Russian economy, not provoke Russia in other ways that would force China to work closely with Russia with the Taiwan situation. So we've now effectively, under this administration, given certain players reasons to help Russia militarily, economically, because now it's not individual anymore. It's about the Eastern Alliance pushing back the Western influence and really making sure they send a message to the West that we are not to be threatened. We're not to be told how to govern. Our way of life is our way of life. Democracy and the principles you believe in are not our principles. So I think we're now seeing the bear waking up, and the bear is now fighting for the piece of food. And when that piece of food is that you get the biggest piece if you're the smartest, most clever animal in the jungle. And I think right now, China is the greatest threat to Western democracy. And now they've got a new coalition of power that will transform how we see power, the great power competition. It's not one-on-one anymore. It truly is the West versus the East.
I think what's interesting with Russia is that there have been signs over the years, like what we saw with after 2014, the closer relationship with China and the new,
speaking of which, I do recall that we were talking a little.
Sorry? What was that, Nabil?
I don't know, I guess we cut each other off because of our unstable connection. My question was about, speaking of how it is East versus the West, it does kind of remind me of how it seemed with what happened in Afghanistan, there was a lack of exit strategy as there was with Iraq, if anything. Right now, with the Biden administration, it looks like what we've done is basically done almost a repeat, because we have the Taliban take over the country in like less than a week. And what does this really mean for us, if anything? Are we going to be seeing another kind of caliphate system as we already saw with the emergence of ISIL in, Iraq and Syria, because it does leave another vacuum. And the lack of nation building that took place in Afghanistan and the operations that took place over there seems to have not really yielded any desired results once we left. If anything, it was all undone fairly too quickly. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, having spent 2 years of my life in Afghanistan, two campaigns there, the question, is a few things. When you withdraw from a country that has terrorist state or terrorist organizations that were successful for carrying out some of the biggest attacks in American history on American soil, how do we want to draw down? We've got some of the smartest, bravest, most talented military in the world, with preparing them to go to war college and, all that training, the strongest military in the world, and we could not strategically draw down correctly. Now, number two, we left Americans behind, not we, they left Americans behind. They equipped the caliphate with more weapons and more money that they needed in order to create the right caliphate and to defend the caliphate, essentially. And then here we go with events being carried out. They just took out Al-Qaeda's leader. Again, timing is everything. We have, within 1 week with Taiwan, Afghanistan, all these different attacks have now pushed these people to be closer and seek coalitions that are anti-Western ideology. If you recall, Al-Qaeda was looking at trying to normalize their government, for example, okay? And this is so they can join global economies, so that they can attempt to present a very safe bet. We are a safe bet. We're going to help our women join with women's rights. We're going to do trade. And only 3 or 4 nations today recognize that government. And the United States is not one of those nations. So they were supposed to be moving toward, let's call it, a more normalized government. And now with this particular situation and the timing, as ill-advised as it was, we go after terrorists. We're all about that business. But when and how, and those two things must be carefully, strategically, looked at in terms of pros and cons. Now we have more conflicts now that will work against America from a terrorist viewpoint, and they will do whatever it takes to carry out attacks on Americans and on American soil. And again, we left our Afghan partners behind, not we, them, left our Afghan partners behind who served with us side by side against the Taliban, fighting against Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And now look where our trust in terms of, do you trust America after what happened in Afghanistan? And this was the catalyst of really judging America as potentially someone you can't work with. They leave their people, they leave their own people behind. And this was a very bad PR campaign for America. And we are literally seeing other nations challenge our peace and security position around the world. And Afghanistan gave everybody a view into the fact that America did not protect its own, and it didn't protect its allies. So again, major changes happening. I predict within a year from now, the Taliban will have a coalition. I think ISIS obviously will work, ISIL will work to try to normalize, but they will work with China. They will work with Russia. They potentially may work with Iran for this next chapter in Eastern Alliance realignment. I do see that changing.
Do you think the strike on the Al-Qaeda leader, do you think that's a precursor for the U.S. possibly going back into Afghanistan? Because I think some people have talked about that, but I'm not sure. I'm not convinced yet.
It would be ill-advised, and you can't be the type of government that can't make up its decisions about its commitments. Again, CIA, State Department, USAID, we spent billions of dollars and we didn't get anything out of it at the very end. It's extremely difficult to fight uphill. America, in terms of our economy, in terms of our economics, we don't have, I would say, with even our debt ceiling, we don't have the economics in order for us to carry out another conflict going back into Afghanistan. I think we need to reel our money in. We need to get smarter about dropping the debt. Okay, we need to really focus on America. We're tied into this global ecosystem, but I think any additional conflicts would effectively put us in a very dangerous position economically. And I think we really need to focus on America first and get. And when I say America first, I mean strategically intelligent objectives that do make us a stronger country. But at the same time, we still have to push back Russian aggression, China aggression. And lastly, I'll say NATO has just committed $1 billion+ to push back Chinese expansion, but it's a little late. It's not the first time we've committed cash, but we spent all this money in Ukraine. We got money going out. We got the pandemic. We've got now new issues like monkeypox. I mean, at some point in time when we're in this strong of a debt position, we can't afford to take on another 20, 30, 40 billion per conflict. It just isn't realistic from a business perspective.
Well, a lot of it does boil down to money, and from an economy perspective, debt is a very big issue, not just with China, but here in the West, here in the U.S. And there's a lot of talk about trying to switch to digital currencies, and there are people who are for it. There's people who are against it. People tie a lot of stuff to it. And if I recall, Israel they've been gradually heading towards digital currency or having limitations in terms of how much people can have in terms of hard cash versus digital. Is that supposed to be an answer to dealing with all the economic issues while dealing with the real world issues and all of that?
Yeah.
I keep trying to figure that out.
Well, the question is, what good does it do, for the globe? And there essentially this is a movement about rebellion against the financial system. It's really what this is. People want, they want to control how fast they spend their money. They don't want to be charged $25 for a transaction because they're doing a wire transfer. They have to wait 2 to 5 business days, or maybe it's a day or 3. So this cryptocurrency is massive here in the East. It's massive. People are making a lot of money, but the problem is what is it tied to? I've seen all type of different things in terms of people saying it's tied. It could be tied to diamonds, and it could be tied to gold, and it could be tied to these virtual commodities and so forth. So I think as you watch this crypto market per se fluctuate, that's one of the issues I would say. But there have been so many people buying into this digital piece because in some way they want anonymity with their transactions. Some people want the speed and agility, and they just want to break away from the system that is providing really adding a tax, whether it be a burden on economics for each transaction, or whether it be, folks can freeze your funds, for example. If you're sanctioned, and if you have crypto, you can't sanction crypto. So there's a lot of different benefits, pros and cons from a digital currency perspective if it's not regulated by the central bank. So this is the value of why President Putin is one of the top, people in the crypto business. Why? Because that money can be transmitted fairly quickly, and if it's on we'll call it decentralized platform, really you could fund terrorism. You could do a lot with that money. And you could even receive money from Iran or Russia right now with cryptocurrency. It's unregulated in some way, shape, or fashion, but some of these centralized platforms have some form of regulatory oversight through like a basic KYC, for example, which is know your customer. But again, it's all about having the freedom of controlling your money and really rebelling against the financial system and framework that's been put in place. And you got a lot of people who are, in the mafia or in it conducting illicit activities that prefer cryptocurrency, digital currency, given its benefit, the ones that I've kind of outlined.
Yeah. And it also seems that with, like you were mentioning earlier, that there's a lot of countries that are experiencing, either they currently are, like Sri Lanka, or they're on the verge of like Arab Spring style events. It's a friend of mine who worked at USAID in Afghanistan several years ago. And but it seems like you're on the verge of seeing a lot of those events type of happen.
I mean, I think I studied the Arab Springs very closely. I mean, with the Arab Springs, the U.S. government invested in an outcome that was supposed to be pro-democracy, okay? And the Muslim Brotherhood and, investing in that organization, having CIA involved, to make sure that the long-term objectives were accomplished. And we did see the youth carry it forward. We saw a lot of young people went out and they fought, and it became contagious essentially, and that was the goal. It was supposed to be pro-democracy, and then at the very end, what happened with that investment wasn't what we wanted to happen with that investment. So it had a lot of different complexities. It was centered on pro-democracy in terms of igniting the fire, but at the very end, we pretty much equipped the Muslim Brotherhood with a global organization that could really, when they had enough power, enough influence, could really become a Rottweiler and fight back. So, again, it's kind of hard to draw the nexus between that particular conversation with Arab Springs, but what we'll see with this particular conversation is similar strategies in the United States government that will be using similar frameworks like what happened with Arab Springs in order to combat China. So it'd be in our best interest to see the Chinese people rebel as one tool of overthrowing. If we wanted to be looking at all the options on the table, we probably will not see that. But again, every option will be weighed so that we can outmaneuver the Chinese Communist Party, and we'll do whatever it takes. But we've got to be smart about what direction we want to travel in. But we've learned our lesson with the Arab Springs, and we definitely don't want to make the wrong mistakes by enabling organizations. And we fanned the fire, and it grew so big that it became very difficult to contain, influence, and manage. And at a certain point in time, we see historically that we end up killing our investments. Whether in Afghanistan, we withdrew, that's a form of killing your investment. And then in other investments, we've done similar decisions. So we want to make sure whatever money we spend, we get the ROI that we're looking to get back. And I think we've got a lot of lessons that we can learn from, but we need a war room strategy. We need new people, we need new ideas, and we're not going to see innovative strategies if we continue to lean on the same people in Washington who continue to cough up the same strategy year in and year out.
Nabil, is there anything you want to add to that?
I've seen a lot of things being taking place in DC, and I can agree that sometimes you need to do different approaches, if anything, than what has been used in the past. We need to be more innovative. You have to really strengthen the relationships between our countries as when it comes to the foreign policy decisions. Some of them have become more strained as of lately, and that's only due to the hyperpoliticization that we have been witnessing as of lately. I don't really have too much to add, if anything, but I can definitely agree as to where you are coming from, because it does look like the local politics in DC seem to be spilling over into the foreign policy agenda as to how the foreign affairs is going to be conducted. It's almost kind of like pretty much the executive branch or the political party in power is not necessarily looking after America's best interests as a whole and being unbiased, if anything. They're usually trying to go within their political leanings, if anything.
Yep, absolutely. And
is that fair to say?
It's exactly, you're on the right track, 100%. It's the question of why did we allow Nancy Pelosi to travel to Taiwan? One story is we believe in democracy. We believe in, now we say we believe in protecting our allies. But again, timing is everything. And now we're told potentially these decisions are going to have more negative impacts globally. At first we had just had a containment strategy with one war. The world didn't react to Afghanistan the way you see the impacts in Russia, Ukraine. We felt Russia, Ukraine. From at the gas pump, we felt it, consumer price index, even travel to certain locations now. All these things have been impacted. We didn't see this level of global integration as the American people just living in America. But now these conflicts are tied to global impacts. And Taiwan and Ukraine will be felt. They will be felt globally, commodity-wise, grain-wise, food-wise, gas. So we have to really make sure the decisions we're making, they're not cowboy decisions. Again, we're pro protecting our allies, but if you know, we don't even have diplomatic relations with Taiwan, and the same thing with Ukraine. So we bet against our policy framework. Our policy framework does say protect the small, but it says you must be a member in some way, shape, or fashion. So I think our foreign policy, in terms of what is realistically on paper with our commitment to these nations, it's a catch-22. You know, I think we have to be bold, we have to be brave, but we just have to be smart and really consider timing, or else we're going to really put the American people at risk. But you're absolutely right. They put politics before the American people. And it's very sad because at the pump, guess who's feeling that? And that's just one impact. That's one impact.
I think the whole mindset issue, like the grand strategy we have is tied now to, for the last few decades, has been tied to globalization with interdependence on everyone. And now, you know, you have multipolarism. You have a concept that I think a lot of people are still learning or figuring. I mean, I think people are understanding that there's, you know, more competition, but what exactly does that mean? You know, supply chains, we're feeling it very hard. And
yeah.
I think there's a lot from policy and strategy. You have to, like you said, get new minds and new blood in to look at it, you know, in order to get different angles to really figure out how to shape the new, you know, approach to handling these situations. I mean, the U.S. can still find a way to pull it off, but I think it's going to take a few years before we get to that point. I really do. I think that's the case. And I think the issue with multipolarism is, I don't think it's quite fully felt here in the U.S. yet. And I think that's a concern I have, because I feel like it's not fully brought up in the narratives in the media and elsewhere. I mean, I write about it every so often, but you know, I mean, it is what it is. And I mean, it's something that's been around throughout history. I mean, globalization has been around throughout history for centuries. And I mean, not like the way it has been the last 3 decades, but I think, you know, it's interesting. And I think it just takes a few more years to really, I mean, I don't know if we have a few years. I mean, it could be, you have to really make some, you know, changes in terms of strategies and policies, you know, before that. But
yeah, it's all about mindset, and it's about mindset, experience. You know, I live with the Arabs. You know, I work alongside them, not just as an American, but in the integrated framework of the royal family. So, you know, the perspective, the things that I've learned, the way they conduct business is much different than anything I've seen in the West. And I think this is why I'm keep continuing advocating for, you know, the dual citizen envoy, or, you know, more investments in our education system that send our kids to spend 6 months overseas in certain locations that are natural hubs for. We got 190 plus nationalities, and I've experienced these nationalities in their rawest form, no dilution. You know, I'm experiencing Russians, sitting with Russians, speaking to Russians, getting their perspectives, sitting with Persians, getting their perspective. And believe it or not, our teaching has told us, you know, we got so many stereotypes that we can't even really understand if they're really true or not. But you come over here and it's completely the opposite. There's Russians who love Americans. There's Iranians who love Americans, you know. So I think that we just need to become the melting pot we once were. We used to see Washington and America as the melting pot. But honestly, I think the melting pot is in the East, because where we have these 190 plus nationalities, the ecosystem for education, you know, it's amazing to see and live this experience and really take it back to the American people and say, I'm much more clearer about the world now. I understand India a little closer because I spend time with Indians here in Dubai, and the rawest experience in terms of engagement. So I'm now officially on this mission to shake as many hands as we can to really get an understanding of what the key priorities are on the other side, and then be a liaison, a bridge builder that is talking truth with experience and real facts. And this is how we should broker our diplomatic relations. But we have to put on two shoes. One shoe is the American shoe, and the other shoe is the Eastern side. And if without that knowledge, we will not be successful. And China will continue to expand its influence, as well as Russia will continue to expand its influence if we don't have a containment strategy that is innovative.
Well, I think Russia is also, they're prepared to invest more heavily in the East now, I think, because of that.
Oh, yeah.
And absolutely.
If I may add, it does look like China and Russia. Well, I do recall Robert Gates, former director of the CIA, stated that when it comes to the relations with Russia and its other countries that it's in partnership with, and even China and the other countries, China and Russia has always been seen as clients, according to him, if anything. And with the new administration, as we are as of right now, part of me wonders is how are we going to move the way forward? Because when it comes to foreign relations or the executive branch, it does seem like, do they seem to have the right mindset in their approach of reestablishing the relationship with these foreign powers, if anything? Because it does not seem as it once was, if anything. And it does look like, which is obvious, that Russia and China are taking the reins, and there may be a shift in the polarity.
For sure. I mean, it's hard to say whether or not the Biden administration has the right mindset overall. Sometimes the objective is disruptive. And I can appreciate a long-term disruptive strategy to get to our end goal. However, I don't think that after 40 years of doing this in Washington, that you can come up and produce new thought processes. I just don't think that it's possible. President Biden was the vice president of the United States. He served as a senator for so long. So, again, we commend our Americans who serve the American people in the best way they know how. In terms of performance and evaluation, we differ there. In terms of quality execution, but the bigger problem now is we need some younger people, and I think really we need younger people who have disruptive strategies that can align with the changing dynamic of geopolitics. And I just don't think that they're the right people for the job, but they have a lot to deal with. And it's never easy when you're in the role. It's a much different day. But at the same time, I think within the last year and a half, we can measure easily what these impacts are, from Russia-Ukraine war to Afghanistan to Taiwan to China emerging as potentially the country that outmaneuvers the United States for the first time. And I think it's been happening, but we're seeing it really come to light in front of us within this last year and a half. And, if we're not careful, the Americans will take a second place to China. And once we're there, it's really difficult in this great power competition to reemerge as the trusted partner, to outmaneuver our adversaries.
I would also add that geopolitics is something that I think a lot of people did not put a lot of emphasis over the years. And then now that you're seeing it more in action, I think a lot of people are playing catch up now and realizing they were more asleep at the wheel. I mean, there's been a lot of signs about that, but it's when it comes to, fresh strategies, like you mentioned, it really plays a role in terms of, how are we going to set things up for the next round of trends and catalysts. I mean, everything we're seeing today, there was a CIA hearing, an intelligence hearing, circa 2008, 2009, foreseeing a lot of the events we're seeing now. So it's I mean, not specifically, but greater competition, in terms of economics, business, technology, arms races, and a lot of the things. I mean, it's not like there wasn't warnings. It's just the culture of passing the buck around to the next person, and that has not been as effective, because now, in terms of figuring out vulnerabilities and threats and weaknesses, it's like you have a lot of problems that have to be remedied very quickly now. It's a very tricky situation.
Yeah, well, hopefully we're able to contribute. I mean, my goal is to be the first envoy, okay? The dual citizenship envoy, first in
Interesting
history.
idea, by the way.
It's never been discussed before. It's never been seen before as even a diplomatic strategy. But if you look at history and how people would marry their daughters to different tribes to connect that family, that was a form of diplomacy. And it was your most precious gift, your son, your daughter, and your daughter went to go off to really represent a larger mission. Now, this doesn't happen often in America because it's not our culture and traditions, but in this world, yes, quite frequently tribes marry, they intertwine, and those have lasting relationships for decades, generations, centuries even. The family that I work for has been around since the 18th century. So the things that I understand in terms of new diplomatic tools, and this is why education is so important, because these tools are only taught to you by the tribes, trust, how we do things, how we negotiate, how we came to this position in history in the UAE or in the GCC, all these tribes, all the traditions that are unknown to the American people. These are diplomatic tools that, if you understand the Western diplomacy framework and you understand the Eastern diplomacy framework, we can keep to our values and principles, but we can also think outside the box. So I think we need to establish new centers of education as well, and change the curriculum. So we need to really look at a larger focus with expanded academic tenets, if you will. And I think we'd have a much more broader mindset, even with our children going into college and so forth, but they're prepared to be global leaders.
Well, this has been a really fascinating discussion. I know we're now getting close to an hour and a half or a little under that, but I think we pretty much covered a lot of good areas here.
Well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah.
I agree. I think we covered a lot of interesting areas.
Good. I'm happy you gentlemen. I enjoyed the conversation.
Absolutely.
I'm going out into the city, and I'm going to step out into Dubai and hang out at the beach, and then I'm still on vacation.
Oh, that's great. Well, I want to thank you again. This has been a terrific meeting, and really great ideas you brought up. I really appreciate it. We have a lot of interesting things to cover, but I think for people watching this, I think it's going to give them some good insights and some good information too, because it's a lot of stuff to soak in, and it's a good place to start. And so if you want to, we can do this again sometime, and
happy to
do some updates, and it'll be very interesting.
I look forward to it, Sam.
Well,
right.
Okay. Nabil, thank you. Gentlemen, have a great evening. I will talk to you all soon.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Good one. Enjoy the beach.
Thank you. I will. Thanks again, guys. Cheers.
Well, that concludes our discussion of this 6th episode of the Fulcrum Global Podcast. Once again, I'd like to thank Adam Roosevelt for taking the time to discuss with Nabil and I on the current Middle East situation and how it impacts both the Russia-Ukraine war and U.S.-China tensions that continue to escalate. This was an insightful discussion and a firm reminder that there's always more going on in the world than one might realize. That is one of the key goals of this podcast because, well, that's what we do around here. I'd like to personally thank you for taking the time to listen and watch this podcast. There will be more to come, so be on the lookout for future episodes and check out our website at fulcrumglobal.us. Also, feel free to subscribe to our YouTube channel and mailing list on our website. So on that note, I bid you all farewell. Until next time, stay safe, sane, and savvy. Bye.